My name is Joshi Herrmann. I started a local newsletter in Manchester 5 years ago called The Mill. I'd been a journalist for 12 years at that point. I'd worked for the Evening Standard on staff. I'd written for various national newspapers like The Guardian and The Times and The Telegraph. And I wanted to try and create a version of local news, a brand of local news that didn't feel like traditional local news for a variety of reasons, one of which is that in my career I've enjoyed doing in-depth feature writing, highly reported features and investigations. And the other reason was that big media companies have been giving away journalism for free for 20 years in the local news space, and therefore it's very difficult to get people to pay for local news unless it feels sort of demonstrably different to what's already out there. So I tried to create a brand of local news that would feel different from what's already out there. There's going to be a certain amount of going back to click on the laptop in this talk. This was one of my first things I wrote on the newsletter. I started it on Substack. We've now moved to a different platform called Ghost, but we started on Substack. And in July 2020, I wrote this post that tried to make the case for what I called a new newspaper. It was a sort of an audacious claim, given that there was one person, no office, no team, no freelancers, to call it a newspaper. But I wanted to have the sense that what we were doing is in some way trying to get back what people used to get from local newspapers. So that's what I called it, and I found that a lot of people connected with the idea. Our company, Mill Media, now has titles in 6 cities. Our latest one is The Londoner in London, which I'd love you to sign up for if you live in this neck of the woods. But they all follow the same principle of doing in-depth, highly reported journalism, nuanced writing, beautiful cultural features, and a sort of core of investigative journalism. So the stuff that probably gets us the most growth, gets us the most news-paying subscribers is investigative journalism, which I think slightly goes against the orthodoxy at the moment of journalism, that you do the investigative stuff to kind of like, satisfy your team that you're doing the right thing or that it's part of your mission, and that you do loads of other stuff to make money. We've found with our model, where people are specifically paying for this journalism, that our biggest growth moments are highly correlated with the moments when we're publishing stuff that has taken weeks or months, or sometimes more than a year to put together, which is obviously a good sign. That type of journalism pays for us. And I want to talk about a few of the stories that have worked, and the broader theme of how do you do investigative journalism that grabs people, that engages people, so that it becomes something that actually grows your subscriptions or grows your audience, rather than the kind of virtuous thing to do on the side alongside a whole bunch of other more commercial sort of work. This is our office in Manchester. I thought we'd just give you a little sense. Very proud that someone called it the most beautiful office in new media. Great achievement. And we also have a little office in London now and in these other cities as well. We've had support from people like Tina Brown, which I don't think is because what we're doing is like sort of otherworldly in quality. I think it's because there is a massive lack of innovation in UK media, I think. There is a lack of really interesting long-form feature writing in the UK, and I think when people see someone doing something like that, they react very positively. I think one of the reasons we've been able to grow, one of the reasons we've been able to sort of build a sustainable audience is because there is a huge demand for this kind of reporting and this kind of journalism in the UK, and there is a diminishing supply of it. Over the past 20 years, there are fewer and fewer people doing local journalism, point one, but there are also fewer and fewer people doing really great investigative journalism in the country. There are some wonderful stories being published in the UK, but if you look back, I think, to the 1980s, 1990s, and you read a national newspaper weekend supplement, you will find stories in there that someone like Geeta Sareni, who's one of my sort of journalism heroes, had been working on for 3 months or something, right? You find that less and less now, and therefore, when someone comes along to do something interesting, I think it tends to get a lot of sort of attention. The theme that I want to talk about is this idea of like how do you do investigative journalism in a way that people want to read. I'm sort of preaching to the choir in some respects. There are people in this audience who clearly already do investigative journalism that people want to read, because I recognise some faces in the crowd. But I think it's worth thinking about what the principles are that make certain stories readable some stories perhaps less so. These are two stories that we recently had listed for the Paul Foot Award, which to my mind is the best investigative journalism prize in the country. One was in Liverpool on our title in Liverpool called The Post, about a sort of charity kingpin in Liverpool who had been given enormous praise in the local media, turned out to have a lot of questions about what was happening to the millions of pounds that are coming into his charity, and that were somehow ending up on the balance sheet of private companies that he and his wife, a Labour councillor, controlled. The other story on The Mill, which is our Manchester title, the first one that I created, is about a man called Sacha Lord. He was an advisor to Andy Burnham, who's the mayor of Greater Manchester. We showed that his company had acquired a large sum of money from the government during the pandemic on the basis of an application that was incredibly misleading, and it took a long time for him to accept that and resign, etc. Well, I'm not sure he's accepted it, but he's resigned. So I'd like to talk a little bit about those two stories, i.e. make the points I'd like to make via some examples from those stories and a couple of others. My dream of standing over there in the open has not paid off. The first point I want to make is that I think that for me, and I think this won't be true for everyone, but for me, storytelling is sort of a key concept that maybe in investigative journalism can sometimes fall by the wayside, because when we're investigating things, we end up with sort of dozens of incredibly interesting pieces of information, documents, etc. And what we want to do as journalists is sort of to expose as many of them as possible. You know, I found all these amazing things, I need to tell readers about them. But if you think of how a novelist or a Netflix producer would think about what their job is, they would, of course, first of all think, like, what is the story? Like, what is the story arc? How do I build tension? How do I resolve it? Who is the character? Who's the person in the story who goes through some sort of storytelling arc? I don't think investigative journalists can always make a story fit a perfect sort of story arc, but I think storytelling is inherently more compelling, more interesting to people than just like a whole bunch of information. So, like, you know, this story, which I'm sure many of you read by David Gran, is not an investigative piece, but it's the kind of piece that got me into journalism because it's a great story. You know, the journalist goes to spend time with the guy who's trying to find this giant squid, right? And he's like, he's with him in the ups and the downs. You have the classic sort of novelistic arc of things are going to go well, then they're going badly, then there's a setback, then the boat is too small, there's a storm, etc. It's beautiful storytelling, and that's, I think, the kind of story that stays with you more than just a whole bunch of information. I think if you imagine yourself like kind of going to the pub or telling your friend about something on WhatsApp about that happened to your day, it'd be very unusual for you to sort of tell them all of the most important information at the start, wouldn't it? Like, you wouldn't sit down and tell them like the 3 most important facts, because that would ruin the story. That would be like the sort of pub session over, right? The way you tell a story as a human being is you start with something that happens at the start. It's a sort of exposition. You're going to mention that there's some really mad stuff coming, but you're not going to explain it. Again, that would ruin the story. You're using the same storytelling techniques that like filmmakers make, that novelists use, and I think that we as journalists need to think more about what those techniques are, because they're incredibly compelling. They create emotional connection with the audience. This kind of like way of looking at stories, or you guys will have seen different formats for how to think about like narrative journalism. They don't always perfectly fit. Like, I often find when I'm planning out a story with a reporter, we have 17 full-time staff writers now across our titles, and lots of sort of independent and freelance journalists as well. When I'm planning out a story with one of the writers, I normally can't plot a perfect story arc. I can't always have like the character who grows through the story and the setbacks and then the dramatic moments that move the action forward. But there's normally aspects of the narrative style or the narrative techniques that novelists use, etc., that we are using, right? There are moments of crisis. There are moments of setbacks. There's moments of character development. How does this human being deal with the things that are thrown at them? Are they corrupted? Are they not? Are they tempted by something? Are they not? So I find when I'm planning out a story, I can't get the full arc, but like I'm trying to think about the arc, because I think that's ultimately what really brings a story to life. The second thing is that when I'm training up journalists who I'm working with, about half of my team would be people who I hired straight out of university or hired them after 1 year that they were working in a local newspaper or something. And actually both of those stories earlier that got Paul Foot listed were both from people who either have only ever worked with us from 3 years after graduating from uni, they've been with us for 3 years and now they're doing that kind of work, or they've done like 1 year at a local newspaper or something. So these are people who've tried to learn our method and tried to learn our storytelling techniques. And what we try to emphasize a lot, my editors and I, is that when you're going out and reporting on a story, you are not just trying to get the standard things that you learn about a journalism school. Quotes, colour, facts, corroboration. What you're actually looking for is scenes, right? You've got to tell stories in scenes. Scenes are the most important storytelling technique. The great stories open with an amazing scene, have another amazing scene quarter way through, another one half the way through, etc. Any kind of novelist or Netflix producer would know that, of course, that is their stock in trade. But for us as journalists, I think, I was actually looking at a story today when I was on the train on the way down here that one of my editors sent me. The story hadn't opened with the most important scene. It hadn't opened with even a particularly grabby scene. That now needs to sort of change, before we publish it. So when my writers come back and they say, I've spoken to this person, there was like a key meeting in this university where everything was decided that they were going to, cut 300 jobs, or something was decided in this company, I'll always say, can you go back to the source and find out where was the meeting? How many people were there? What was the atmosphere? What were people wearing? How similar was that meeting to other meetings? Like, what struck people in the meeting as unusual? Because then you're giving the reader a couple of paragraphs that get them inside the room. And so I emphasize scenes an awful lot. There's a particular scene in one of our stories that comes to mind. We did a story about a chef called Simon Martin. This is the headline. Not a flattering headline for him. And he was a brilliant chef, ran the only Michelin star restaurant in Manchester, but also, afterwards spoken to 15 or 16 of his staff, turned out to be an absolute tyrant at the same time. And we went to speak to him about it, and we I think my reporter Jack worked on it, not his only project, as one of his projects for maybe 6 months. But this is an amazing scene where this chef, Simon Martin, we have explained in the article that he trades on his reputation as having worked for Red Zeppi, the sort of famous chef in a Danish restaurant. And a lot of his kind of respect from his staff came from the fact that he'd worked with this amazing chef, right, this world-class chef, the best chef in the world. And there's a scene where they're on a sort of night out together, I can't remember the exact details, and they're all sitting around, and he's chatting to Red Zeppi, right? He's chatting to the best chef in the world. What an amazing sort of thing to see your boss talking to the best chef in the world. And then, after a while, one of the staff members noticed that Martin's phone was showing its home screen. Not only was Martin not speaking to the greatest chef in the world, he wasn't speaking to anyone, right? Amazing scene, like nothing kind of, there's no amount of explanation of Simon Martin that could convey the strangeness, the narcissism of the guy, as well as that little image, right? People talk to me about that image all the time. There's another image in the piece where there's a live eel in the restaurant and he's chopping it. He's chopping the live eel into loads of pieces and blood is going everywhere. Those two scenes, people talk about them all the time. They capture something. Scenes can capture something about a story and about a person much better than any sort of amount of exposition or explanation, I think. The third point, of my 5, don't worry, there are 5, not 10, not 20. The third point is that great stories hinge on great characters. And that's not a traditional thing for investigative journalists to think about, I think. Because I think when we're investigating, we always think like, our job is just to get inside the machine, to expose to the open what is hidden. But I've found that for us, the most compelling stories we've done have had a very strong central character. There's a sort of idea in like sort of narrative journalism that what people really want from a story when they're reading it is to learn how other human beings would deal with certain scenarios, right? Because then in your head, you're thinking when you're reading something, how would I have dealt with that? How would I have dealt with that? If there's a flood coming up to your house, how would I have dealt with that? If there's a sort of an ethical issue inside a company, would I have covered it up or would I have exposed it? And so you put you try, I think, when you're editing these stories, to get your reporters to find who is the character that people are going to latch onto. I had a seemingly very dull housing story 2 years ago about a very complicated bit of the supported housing market involving a stock market listed investment fund, involving contracts that allowed people to make large amounts of money in the social housing sector. But even to me, as someone who I think broadly understands business at a basic level, it was very difficult to understand. And therefore I thought my readers are really going to struggle. But where we had the breakthrough with the story and where I kind of gave it the go-ahead was when we realized there was an amazing central character that we could focus on and that people would latch onto. And if you want people to spend 20 minutes of their Saturday morning reading your investigation, you better try and latch them on early, right? You know when you're reading the Sunday Times or you're in the magazine and then you read the first 3 paragraphs of the feature and then you go to the next page because you didn't like it, whatever. You've got to grab people's attention. And I think having a central character who's introduced as a human character very early on is an unbelievable way of keeping people inside the story, because you believe the story is important. You think this complex bit of the housing sector needs to be publicly understood, but you are not going to get them to the 800-word mark or the 2,000-word mark in that story unless they're engaged, and that's what characters give you. This guy called Gurpal Judge is an extraordinary character. He's based in Wolverhampton and Birmingham. This was his backstory. He used to be a lettings agent. He's very young, and then he was on a Buddhist retreat in Devon. He said for 5 days he heard not a single human voice, reported The Independent, in a glowing profile. Judge switched on his phone and saw a message from someone at the local night shelter where Judge had been volunteering. Anyway, this guy has a sort of come to Jesus moment where he realizes that he shouldn't be a letting agent. He should be helping to solve homelessness, right? Then he gives an interview to the national press where he says he's going to solve homelessness. Like, what a backstory, like what a guy. Like, you'd want to know, like, is this a guy who's got good intentions, he's acting in good faith, and then later something goes wrong and he turns out to be running something where people are living in such horrendous housing conditions that one woman died in one of his flats, who she's supposed to be receiving hours of support every day, paid for by state benefits, and no one discovered her for days and days. That journey that he's been on, people want to know, right? People want to know that because that's a character story. That's what character, I think, gives you. The other thing that I think you need, which is almost the opposite of the character point, is you need to readers need to understand why the thing that you're exposing happens, right? What is the context? So that concept of the ladder of abstraction, which I'm sure you've heard about, right? And like most news happening in the middle of the ladder of abstraction. There's a great book whose author I've forgotten, I think he's called Hart, who writes about narrative journalism, and he says most conventional news reporting happens in the middle, right? But great feature writing, you've got to be at the bottom and you've got to be at the top, right? The bottom of the ladder of abstraction is, I am at Gurpal Judge's house and I've opened, he's opened his door and he's swearing at me. Like, you are there, right there meeting. There's no abstraction at all. We're not having to abstract at all. We're not talking about Wolverhampton. We're not talking about his company. We're not talking about the general letting sector. We're not going up the ladder of abstraction, right? We are right at the bottom, and because we're feature writers, we are telling people exactly what we're seeing with our eyes. And then at the very top of the ladder of abstraction is like, well, you've totally abstracted from that and you have to explain how the industry works, right? Why is it that Gurpal Judge can have a company that suddenly has income of millions of pounds, even though it's supposed to be some sort of non-profit? He says he's helping people, but people are living in terrible conditions. How does that happen? How does a guy in his 20s who's supposed to be a lettings agent suddenly become a guy who can apparently provide housing on behalf of the state for thousands of the most vulnerable people in society? How does that happen? So then you go to the top of the ladder of abstraction and you get the why, right? You've got to explain the why. we discuss in this story a little bit about what Gopal Judge's motivations might be, but as you guys know, as journalists, it's extremely difficult to get into people's motivations. You can speculate, you can maybe fill in some gaps, but you can't know. But then we say, on a broader level, what was going on inside Judge's head doesn't particularly matter. What matters is that the broken system of supported housing allowed him to take responsibility for so many people's lives, right? And then we go even further up the ladder of abstraction to say this is actually about how the British state looks after its most vulnerable people, right? This kind of failure is what happens in the vacuum where publicly funded services used to be, where the state has stepped aside from its duties to look after the most vulnerable people in society in the hope that unproven private providers, backed by hard-nosed investors, will be able to do things on the cheap. So that one paragraph, which is quite near the end of the story, after we've given you loads of personal stuff about him, what kind of boss he was, what was it like inside the office, how bad were the flats, the tragic sort of conditions that people were living in. There's one paragraph there that gives you the why. This is why this kind of thing happens, because the British state has farmed out a key part of its function to private providers backed by FTSE 100 investors, and this is the sort of disastrous result. I think giving people the why gives a lot of readers like a sense of satisfaction that you don't feel when you only just find out like all these bad things happened. Showing that bad things happened is key, but I don't think it's enough. Okay. The other example, we carried on this investigation. We actually ran this investigation into this particular form of supported housing in 4 cities, Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool, and we did a bit in Sheffield, I think, as well. So this one was the one that got Abby listed for the Paul Foot. She was a finalist. She's, by the way, I don't want to get her age wrong, but she's sort of like 25 or something, right? And her story about this guy, Peter Mitchell, another great character, by the way, former Labour councillor, somehow ends up running a food bank. Suddenly the food bank goes from having a sort of organisational income of like £200,000 a year to like 14 million, right? How does that happen? And how has no one noticed, right? This guy's suddenly shot from being a guy who runs a food bank to suddenly his charity's making these enormous amounts of money coming in. Where's the money going? Well, is it going on the people who are living in his houses? Are they living in wonderful houses that have excellent support? Apparently not. But this guy allows us to tell, again, this complicated story. And I think this is another example of like the telling of the why. Once you introduce him as a character, we've introduced how bad the housing is, etc., similar to the one with Gopal Judge. What we say here is that this new investment model exploited what now looks like a loophole in the state's provision of housing to its most vulnerable citizens. Same point as the last one, right? But we give a bit more detail in this one. Private landlords like Home Reach, which is a big stock market listed fund, aren't allowed to rent out the properties themselves because only non-profit entities can receive the higher benefit, which is the advanced benefit, right? That's what supported housing is all about. The idea was that the charities with track records of supporting vulnerable people would be used, but Mitchell, along with a handful of other similarly entrepreneurial figures across the UK, had been alerted to the loophole and stepped in. So we are trying to show, after thousands of words of showing the financial records show that £1 million ends up in this private company that he controls, £2 million ends up in this private company that he controls. We've gone right into the detail. We've gone to the flat. We've met a woman who was living in one of his flats and who witnessed a suicide from one of his one of her friends who lived in the flats. We've shown the appalling conditions, but at this point we're zooming out right to the sort of nearer the top ladder of abstraction, and we're saying this is how this thing works, right? This is how this piece works. And I think you want readers to finish your piece and be like, I'm emotionally grabbed by the character and by the details, but I also really understand a piece of British public policy that I would never normally have known, I've never read about in the national newspapers, that no one's ever explained to me, and now you kind of understand it. Okay, I think the last point is about sort of getting readers involved in investigations. So I mentioned this guy Sacha Lord earlier, who's Andy Burnham's advisor. He's a sort of well-known businessman in Manchester. He organises the Warehouse Project, club nights, some of you might have been to. He organises music festivals. And during the pandemic, he became a very well-known advocate for the hospitality industry writ large. And crucially, he was appointed by Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, to be an advisor, a nightlife economy advisor. And so what happened was we wrote a large profile of Sacha Lord, I think in 2023, very long profile, 2-part profile. And it wasn't particularly scoopy or investigative. People had plenty to say about him, but we spent a lot of time with him as well. But because people liked that profile, a year later, a source got in touch with us to say that he had used to work for one of Sacha Lord's companies. He had evidence that Sacha Lord's companies had illegitimately gained about £500,000, 400 and something thousand, from the government during the pandemic by claiming to be an all-singing, all-dancing sort of creative arts company so that it could get money from the Arts Council during the pandemic. In fact, this man said, and he used to be a director of the company, it was a security company. It had only ever been a security company, and Sacha Lord and his fellow directors had only changed the name of the company and the purposes of the company on its website when they realized they could get this cash from the government, right? So this story resulted in Sacha Lord threatened to sue us. I'm sure you've all received legal letters from lawyers saying we're going to sue you, etc. Something I've actually never experienced was the person who's threatening to sue you going to the Times and telling the Times that they're threatening to sue you, and then having a story in the Times saying Mayor's nightlife czar sues news site over so that's kind of a ramping up of the pressure on an independent media company like us. And it's sort of saber rattling, isn't it? It's sort of like, I'm going to be very public about my desire to take these guys on. So the legal threat was sent to me on a Friday late afternoon, one day after we published the story. And the threat was a specific ultimatum. If you don't take this story down by Tuesday at, I think it was 4 p.m, then we will be taking you to the High Court and we'll be suing you for defamation. And there was a lot of kind of, he told the Times he had appointed a specialist defamation KC, et cetera, et cetera. So we had a decision to make. And something that I learned from this episode, and I actually wish I'd learned this lesson earlier, was that when you are facing these kind of moments with your investigative journalism, it's so valuable to get your readers more involved. When I've been threatened in the past, I've generally consulted our lawyers and sent back a reply, etc. In this one, I decided to go public with it because I felt that it was only by going public about his threats and involving our readers that we could actually win the battle. He's got more money than us. He has got the backing of Andy Burnham and his organisation. Andy Burnham's organisation had not said that they were going to investigate. So we were in a bind. And some of my friends and advisors were calling me up and saying, you're in a bad spot here, because he can say the Arts Council have looked into this before, which was true. He can say Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, is backing him, which is true. Or at least Andy Burnham wasn't sort of doing anything about the story, wasn't looking into it. So I was in I think, a difficult spot. And he had this Tuesday deadline. So what I did is on the weekend, I wrote this post up there, where I basically said, if Sacha Lord can send us evidence, we've already asked for, we've already contacted him many times, but if he can send evidence that our story is wrong by Tuesday, 4 p.m, we'll take it down and we'll apologise. But in the meantime, if you, our readers, could help us out, we're going to publish the document publicly. So this FOI document that we had, we put it out publicly and we put it on our website, and we said to our readers, who include in Greater Manchester, it includes lawyers, it includes former police officers, it includes people who work at the Arts Council. We basically said to our readers, we've got an incredibly engaged audience of readers. We said, here's the document, help us out. We've already reported that 5 or 6 claims in the document are false, help us get it to 10 or 12 or whatever. So the next few days were a furious sort of process of people sending in dozens and dozens of tips. I had a whole team of our journalists, even from our other cities, just in the office working on those tips. And 3 days of us publishing more and more damning details about how he had misled the Arts Council eventually resulted in the dam breaking. First, the Arts Council said that they were going to launch a new investigation into him. Then Andy Burnham, sort of dragging his feet, had to do the same. They were going to look into it. But Sacha Lord still didn't resign. I think a day later, he said he was withdrawing his legal threat, and it took, I think, 7 months of doing more digging into it and putting pressure on the Arts Council, putting pressure on Andy Burnham. Eventually, Sacha Lord quit his job in January this year, so sort of 7 months later. But I felt that we'd only got that result because we opened things up. It wasn't really the original story that got us there. It was the opening things up to the audience and saying, you are our kind of powerful thing here. We've got you. And it resulted in a massive new wave of subscriptions. It resulted in loads of people tweeting about us and standing up for us, etc. We were kind of able to deploy our audience in a way that I think I've really learned from, and I'd like to kind of do again. So he eventually resigned, and I think that what these sort of lawyers, etc., want when they're threatening us with lawsuits, what they really want is a sort of private exchange, right? Because in a private exchange, if you're working for a small independent media company, or indeed like a lot of media companies who don't have a ton of resource, you are at a disadvantage in that exchange, right? They have got the potential to go to court and spend hundreds of thousands, and you often don't. But when it goes public, I feel like you're actually changing the calculus. Suddenly you go public, it's very embarrassing for them. No one wants to look like they're trying to bully an independent media company. You are setting them like an ultimatum of like, well, provide the evidence, the exculpatory evidence. And I find that really works. And so I think that's kind of my final thing about engaging people, is like get people really involved in like key moments when things start to go south. I'm going to take a few questions in a minute. In fact, I'm going to take a few questions now, I think. I'm just going to quickly check the time. But does anyone have any questions we can have a chat about? What's the time? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, up there.
You mentioned the importance of finding characters for your investigations and looking at both ends of the abstract ladder. Do you think there's a danger in looking too much for scapegoat figures where there might not be scapegoats?
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that sometimes like the wrongdoing is extremely institutional, and like putting the focus on like one person could be like a misleading way of doing it. But I think like ultimately our job is not just to get information about wrongdoing out there, right? That is not our job. Our job is to get people to read the information and to use it and to inform their understanding of the world with it. So I think like I would be fairly ruthless as an editor about not choosing stories where I don't think readers will engage. I don't think that's our job. I don't personally see the value in investigations that sort of that don't engage people and just sort of sit there. We're not academics, or some of you are, but the rest of us are not. It's a different trade. My partner's an academic, and their job is to do the work, and it's not supposed to necessarily be read by a ton of people, right? That's not our job, I don't think. Our job is to have an impact and to give people a better understanding of the world. And therefore, I think we should look for stories that people will find compelling. I think, like, as an editor, you can always choose between 5 or 6 stories that your reporters want to do, right? It's not like you've only got one option. I think the onus is on us to try and choose stories that will engage people and will go somewhere. That's how I feel. But I know what you mean. There's possibly I don't think Peter Mitchell or Gurpal Judge were sort of unfair scapegoats, but I'm sure that could happen. Yeah.
Thanks, Joshi. That was so interesting. Just on, you mentioned at the end there that when lawyers are kind of trying to scare you into not publishing or taking something down, they want these private conversations, which is very much my experience too. But I just wondered if you get these letters often with long amounts of information from lawyers countering things or putting new information into your sort of domain, but marked private and confidential, strictly not for publication, and they sort of play this strange game with you where they tell you lots of things on the basis that you're going to end up in further trouble if you actually use any of it. I just wondered how you approach that and whether you do use that information and take the risk, or what are the tactics around sort of trying to get what the lawyers are doing into the public domain as well as.
Yeah, I don't think that people should be able to send you threats and then expect you not to publish them. In the Sacha Lord case, I told the law firm we're going to publish their email, but I think it's maybe polite to tell them.
Yeah. Were they sort of saying you shouldn't?
I actually can't remember if I think they normally argue that you shouldn't, but they've sent you a letter. It's not like I had an agreement with them that we could have an on-background chat, This is sort of like, you send me a letter and don't put stuff in the email that you'll be embarrassed by. I think they were embarrassed, obviously. You don't want to look like you're using those kind of words. It's sort of absolutely absurd threats that these lawyers use, but they paid very well to write these letters. If they don't want things in there that they find humiliating, they shouldn't write the email. So I think just use it and tell them when you're using it. I don't think you should use it gratuitously. I don't think you should sort of expose a lawyer by name necessarily, whatever, because
not so much that, just that they're giving you information.
Yeah, they're giving you information, and they're giving you a crucial piece of information about the subject of the story, aren't they? They are a person who will pay lawyers, £2,000 a day to write you aggressive letters. That's information about that person that I think readers are entitled to know. So I don't have that much respect for these provisos at the top of an email. I think it's different if you are in a legal proceeding with lawyers and there is an understanding that these are sort of privileged interactions. I think that's very different. But the ones that they shoot off threatening you, I think, are ridiculous. Yeah.
Can I just comment from the session that Jill Phillips did yesterday?
Yeah.
So the Guardian lawyer.
Yeah.
So I have a note that she wrote, and she said, unilateral labels, e.g. private and confidential, are not binding to a journalist.
Yeah.
They just make up those words,
yeah.
Try and make it sound like you can't, but they're not binding. And she said, though there might be some information in a letter that you would need to consider. For example, my client has cancer and therefore that's why they're doing this.
Yeah.
You might not want to publish, but she specifically said unilateral labels.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that approach. I mean, she knows a lot more about the law than I do, so I'm glad she's signed up to my approach. But yeah, to me, it's utterly ludicrous that people can send you letters and expect you not to publish them. Yeah, our job is publishing. Yeah.
Just off the back of this, that you went public with the legal threat. Is there a risk that if you did it over and over again, or any organization, any outlet did it over and over again, that readers might get fatigued and start thinking of the outlets, whinging a bit too much?
Yeah, I can't imagine that response, because I've found that one of the reasons that people engage with us a lot is that they like to see how the journalism is made. And receiving threats and having to deal with lawyers, that's part of the process. So we try to show people inside the newsroom. We have pictures of our journalists at work in the intros to our newsletters. We have podcasts where we talk about how a story came together. We have events where we talk, like we had an event recently for our 5th birthday where we talked about 5 stories, our journalists on the stage talking about how they did them, etc. I think people like to see that. And I think in an era where trust in journalism has been declining, and I think it is much too low in the UK, if you want trust, you have to show people how journalism is done, not just say like, we're journalists and we've got this method and it's a secret source. So I think that, obviously if you were doing this every week or something, it would start to get old, but hopefully I wouldn't get a legal threat every week. So I think people appreciate it. I think it tells people something about that person you're writing about that they didn't know. So I think it's worth doing. But I take your point. If you kind of overdid it,
But you're saying that show them how the sausage is made.
Show them how the sausage is made. And the job of all of us is obviously to create journalism that's trusted, right? And when we survey our readers, one of the questions we always ask is, we list 25 media companies and we say, how much do you trust these media companies to tell you the truth, right? The Guardian, Channel 4, The Times, the FT, etc. And we always put our brands in, right? I've never done a survey in 5 years of doing this where people didn't rank our title as the most trusted. Now, obviously, there are readers. They should like our title, right? They've chosen to read it. But they're ranking it ahead of The Guardian, the BBC, the FT, Reuters, etc. because we show them exactly how we do the journalism. We show them how the sausage is made. And I think that gives people a tremendous sense of trust. Whereas I think large media brands struggle to sometimes communicate what it is that they do. Although I've noticed the New York Times now will have little bits of text saying this reporter is based in the occupied West Bank and they've done this thing. I think that's very smart. I think that we should do a lot more of that. Yeah.
Just kind of building on that, how do you sort of balance creating that engaging narrative journalism and showing how the sausage gets made without sort of the reporter kind of becoming the story? I think sometimes what happens to journalists over the course of an investigation can be quite telling in terms of like some of the characters we're dealing with, the situation. But how do you sort of balance folks making that too much story?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that's a key point when you're editing, the amount that the journalist appears in the story. I think there are certain stories that we've done where it's really appropriate for the journalist to be in there. And sometimes you lack a structure, don't you, when you're doing a story? You lack a way of telling the story, and you end up concluding that the best way to tell the story is actually via the journalist's mission to get it. I mean, obviously, all good narratives are, in a sense, a protagonist who is trying to figure something out and has various setbacks. Obviously, a journalist going about the story is a version of that, and a lot of documentaries have that kind of format. So I think sometimes it's super helpful. We did a story about a sort of Angel of the North Star sculpture or statue that was supposed to happen in Sheffield. It was called the Steel Man. And it was a bit of a farcical story about why this thing never happened, right? And it was difficult to tell it in a way that wasn't my journalist trying to figure that out and going to the workshop and getting someone on the phone, but she wrote it in a really good way for that. When I wrote the Gurpal Judge story in Birmingham, it started with me kind of confronting him on his doorstep and him sort of swearing at me. So I think I'm in the story there, but then I kind of recede in the story and I don't really need to be in it again. I think it's a balance, isn't it? I think in an ideal world, you would have scenes and characters so strong that the journalist doesn't need to be in there too much. I think in slightly shorter form versions of feature writing, or slightly less high stakes stories, or maybe ones where you don't quite have the base metals, then sometimes having journalists in there is really good. So I think a bit of a mix. I think if I read a publication and the reporter was in there all the time, it'd be grating. I don't know if you guys find this, but certain podcasts, the amount that they foreground the journalist and how they feel and what they're seeing and can get a bit grating at times. Like sometimes when you're listening to a podcast, I feel sometimes like, can you just tell me the bloody story? So you can go too far with it, I think, and I think podcasting perhaps goes too far with it. Yeah. Okay, yeah, there we go.
I just wondered, because you said obviously you've got a very engaged readership, whether you get tips for investigations from your readers or where you kind of get your investigation stories from.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely found in the early days of doing the Mail, we didn't get as many tips because people didn't know who we were, and we weren't the trusted people to send tips to. But yesterday, or a few days ago, I was catching up on my emails yesterday, we had an email from someone saying, we want to get this story out via a trusted whistleblowing site like yours or something, right? I never would have got that at the start. You have to build up over the years your reputation as that. So we get a lot of tips. I would say probably about a third to a half of our stories are from readers, tips. Quite, a certain number are not as well. But sometimes readers will put you onto things, and then even if it's not a main piece of information, it gets you going. We did an amazing story earlier this year about the University of Greater Manchester, used to be known as the University of Bolton, but they rebranded it for the international market, the University of Greater Manchester, even though they are literally based in Bolton. And just like the Sacha Lord one, that came from readers, but they were readers who had read the last thing that my reporter did on that story a year ago. So I often find it's my reporter has built up a bit of trust with a particular constituency of people, and then they get in touch and say, actually, there's something bigger now. You should come back. So there's quite a lot of that. I think we've launched new titles in the past year in Glasgow, it's called The Bell, and in London, called The Londoner, which again, please do sign up for. And it's definitely more difficult in the early days to do these kind of really headline-grabbing investigations because you just don't have the same network of tipsters. So there was a sort of critique of our Glasgow publication made somewhere online where someone said, like, why are they not doing stories like Sacha Lord? Like, this is the same company that publishes The Mill, but The Mill is doing stories like Sacha Lord and taking down politicians, and their new one in Glasgow, this was like 2 months in, isn't doing that yet. And it's sort of like, right, because you need to do it for like 3 years, building up the credibility and the trust. You need to become known as the place to go to, and then you do get tips. So I find it's a gradual process, yeah.
What's the process, Joshi, in doing the, in coming to a decision to basically say, publish and be down type?
If people couldn't heard that, the question was like, how do you make the decision whether to publish?
Yeah, what process did you go through in making it?
With the Sacha Lord one, it's the usual thing. I mean, I'm working with the journalist on that story for weeks or months or whatever, sometimes days, but normally for an investigation longer. And then we get the lawyer involved maybe in the week before. We have an amazing lawyer called Natalie McAvoy, who is a very pro-publishing lawyer. I know there are lawyers out there who always find reasons that you shouldn't publish. That's not I wouldn't work well with a lawyer like that, because what is the point of starting a media company if you're not going to be very robust and aggressive, I think. And so, I speak to the lawyer and speak to the journalist. I've got an amazing team of editors who I consult. And then on our bigger stories, there's normally me and 2 other editors looking at it, and then we kind of get together and make the decision. But it's very rare for us to work on an investigation and then not publish it. In fact, I can't think of a time that it's happened. We've had stories that we've spiked, but not things that we've been working on for a while. Like, we are very, very pro-publishing. And I find it, as you know, there are lots of large media companies who are constantly working on things and then not publishing them. That would drive me mad. I mean, we don't have the resources to work on stuff and then pull out at the last minute because of something. So we commit, and sometimes we're changing stories a little bit, but if you've been working on something for weeks, you know the truth of it.
You buy into it, don't you?
You buy into it, and you have to understand that risks. The job when you're an editor is not to reduce the risk to zero. That's sometimes I get frustrated with some types of media lawyers. They're like, how do we get the risk down to zero? It's not your job. It's not our job. It's not what we're going to do. We're going to get the risk down to a level where the editor feels that it's appropriate. The upside of publishing the risky story outweighs the risk of the blowback. I think that's where you gotta be. Yeah, but it's hard to really explain the process because it's so sort of instinctive. Yeah.
You said it's not really worth doing something and putting it out there unless it's got to have big impact.
Yeah.
But is there a case sometimes you're halfway through, you know the story's there, but you haven't quite got it.
Yeah.
And you put out a story which in itself is a bit mediocre, but just to see what happens. You know what I mean? Do people contact you with more, almost like a feeler?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the word mediocre, but yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I think so. There's this sort of clever thing that some newspapers do where they'll put out a bit of a kind of story that will bring in more sources, but clearly isn't the whole thing. And we didn't used to do that. We always used to be like, we're the Mill. We put together a really deeply reported thing, and then it's one package. But actually, I think in the past couple of years, I've been a bit more of a convert to the we've got something here. It's definitely true. It's definitely not the full story. I mean, recently we did the latest version of our investigations at the University of Greater Manchester, and we had established that one of the issues in this kind of scandal at the university related to a scheme, a Nigerian scholarship scheme in which dozens of students had come from Nigeria. And it was not the fault of the students in any way, shape or form. But one of the executives who had been suspended after our original reporting had been overseeing this scheme. And so what we wanted to report is just the Mill now knows that this scheme is related to the scandal at the university. And we got that out there, we put it to people, and then now we're getting more information about the scheme. So no, we definitely do that. Definitely. The mediocre middle story approach. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Anything else? Okay, wonderful. Thanks very much for listening, and please do follow our newsletters if you're interested in what we're doing. And thank you very much.
Before you finish, may I just ask one question?
One more question.
Yeah, because here at Goldsmiths, which is where I teach, we're very interested in local journalism, the future of local journalism. Where do you think it's going? Do you see Mill Media going perhaps to on the Axios model, which is now 33 US cities? What's going to happen to local journalism in Britain, do you think?
Yeah, I think I'd have a nervous breakdown if we had 33. I'm already struggling with 6. Yeah, local journalism in the UK is in tremendous trouble. National journalism has undergone cuts, as we know, and layoffs, etc. Local journalism is in much deeper trouble. Since I've been doing this, about 2,500 local journalists have been laid off in the UK, so in 5 years. So that is a very large proportion of the total, so something like 20-30%. So it's in a ton of trouble. Going into the future, the thing that I've been really pleased about is in the past couple of years, I've noticed a lot more people doing the kind of thing we're doing. Lots of different cities now, towns, very, very local or covering a whole big city. There are now lots of people trying basically high quality, highly differentiated journalism published via newsletter. It's a model that works. We've been able to show it works, and now
London Century.
Yeah, the Jim's doing London Century, but there are all sorts now, which is a really, really good sign, because what we basically need, if for the future to be bright, we need every community to have a sort of renaissance in local quality journalism, and I think we're starting to see the grassroots of that happening, so that's really very good to see. Yeah. Cool, thank you guys, thank you.